Hi, I'm Daniel Inouye.
And I'm Scott Allen, and we are here to talk about our book assignments.
Our book assignment. So I got the book Mean Little Deaf Queer by Terry Galloway. I promise this is the book. It's got the title right there. Amazon. So my book was about a young girl who I said this, not the start of her life, but maybe when she was around, I think she said it was 9, and she began to notice, she would start having these weird visions, and she started to lose her hearing, and it was all pertaining to when she was being born. Her mother got, it was an experimental drug that ended up giving her a lot of nervous system issues. I think that's the right term. And kind of what happened was just over the course of her younger life, she started to notice a deterioration in a lot of her motor skills, and by motor skills I mean really just her hearing. I don't know why. And it was it's this really interesting story about her life, how she was telling, when she was growing up, before she noticed any differences. She was in Germany during the Cold War, and her father was a Russian spy, and it's a lot harder than I thought it would be. Just like talking. Essentially, I don't know. She jumps around a lot in the book. Like in one chapter, she'll be like, "When I was 9," and the next one she'll be like, "When I was 50." When she wrote this book, I think she said she was 56. So it's got a big span there. But it discussed a lot about how, the kids didn't necessarily treat her any different, as she was developing these emotions, but to kind of tackle them, she would, in essence, learn how to be mean to other kids and kind of start bullying them to help her get over the issues she was discussing. Like, for example, when she was because as the title says, she's a homosexual, if you will. And it talks about how when she was younger, she hated being all prissy and girly, so she would dress like a boy and act like a boy. So when she started to lose her hearing, she already had an eye problem, it discussed, so she had these thick glasses and hearing aids, with the big pouch you would strap to your front. And she would just take those off and kind of be like deaf and blind to the world almost, and just kind of ignore the issues. And so she would, throw on her flannel and some khakis and like go out with the boys on the playground and like pick on girls and stuff. It was really interesting, just kind of getting like this different point of view of somebody who really, I don't know, was out of tune with the way she was raised to be. I don't know, because while there was some bit of her, trying to fit in and whatever else, she would also, I don't know, she took pride in like being different.
So was she aware that she was being mean on purpose, but didn't necessarily feel that way?
Oh, she acknowledged it like very, very clearly. There was a line, I think, in the book that was, because when she was developing, her mind was developing, she was just like, yeah, like I'm super into girls, and I lusted for the girls, but I desired like just power, and I wanted to be strong, and I wanted to be mean to people. So she, like one of the big things she talked about was how the boys would like grab a girl and they'd take her out behind the dumpster at recess, and they'd hold her down and like spit in her mouth.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and that was like something that she actively took a part of. But then of course she talked about, because like while she takes pride in being mean, she also really wanted to be, I don't know, accepted for her differences. And so the first time that they let her hold down the girl and spit in her mouth, like she couldn't do it after that, because she like saw this look in the girl's eyes, and it just like it ruined it for her. I don't know. It's a little different experience, I'd say. I don't know. She just kind of goes on and on about all these different things. One of them was when she went to a camp. She was talking about how it was a disabled camp, and I don't know. She just has this really different outlook. Even as a kid, she did. Like for example, at the camp, there was this whole discussion about how she was, deaf and blind, which made her already a little less disabled than most of the other kids at the camp, as she put it. people. She called them things.
Oh, she called them things.
Yeah, she did. Things out of an Ultra Chore book, I think she put it. Just essentially people with, missing limbs and distorted bodies that grew differently. And it's this she's got this outlook about it that's almost like sarcastic and depressing. It's just a little different, but essentially the big thing about it, what she was telling the stories, was how there was a pool there, and there was a shallow end where the kids who had bodily dysfunctions would essentially just float, and they called them she called them floaters. But then there was also the deep end where kids who were slightly less disabled, who were deaf or just blind, would get to go and they'd get to swim and race, and they separated all the kids by age, and so there were 2 other girls her age who could swim in the deep end. A girl with missing a leg, and then there was also a girl she was blind. And then she delves into like how there was this deep end instructor who was, as she puts it, a shapely woman who fit her body well, and she was essentially the deep end lifeguard, as I'm pretty sure. And so she would help the kids race, and she would do the arm signal for the deaf girl and shout for the blind girl to go. And Terry in the book was the strongest swimmer, so she would win a lot of the races, and at the end of the camp summer there'd be, they'd get awarded like best swimmer, won all the races or something. But the one that there was the last race that really would have decided her the victor, and she wanted to win because that would mean that the lifeguard would come put the medal on her, and that was like her big prize. However, for whatever reason, the one-legged girl wanted to call the start, of the race. And the problem with that was that she, was getting ready to do her start. So she shouted go when they were all supposed to go, but obviously that's not good for the blind girl because she depended on the person to give the arm signal to go. So partway through her race, she's like, all right, well, I'm not going to win, so I'm going to get the real prize, the lifeguard. And so she faked to drown. So she faked drowning and like held a bunch of water in her mouth and stuff so that when, they did compressions and mouth to mouth, she'd like spit up the water.
How old was she at this point?
I think she was 12. Ish. I believe that was it. I have heard, because again, she jumps around. It was hard to tell, but it was really funny because then she was just like, and that's when I knew I was going to be an actor, and I got the real prize. Sure, they technically still gave me like a pity medal of like strongest swimmer, but I got the real prize, and that was to kiss the lifeguard.
Wow, that's very manipulative.
It was really, yeah, it was, and it was kind of like, man, it's awful. I was a lifeguard. I understand that. Like, that's awful feeling when somebody starts drowning. But she was just like, yeah, and I got to like, be all close, and she hugged me. But then she also talks about how later that night she wanted to go talk to her, and tell her that it was fake, and she was just like, I knew I couldn't. Like, I'd break down and I'd start crying all night.
Oh.
So, yeah, I don't know. It was just really, it was a different point of view.
So did it span most of just her childhood, or did it also go into the adult years?
So it kind of separates the book into 3 sections, and the first was a lot of the childhood. The second chapter, or the second section, kind of jumped around a little more, and then the last was, a lot of it was like the recent stuff she talked about, like when she got digital hearing aids, obviously as things progressed, and then they offered to give her a cochlear implant, and she was just like, no, I don't want that, like, now at this point the deafness is like something that I've come to love and all this, but then at the end of the very end of the book she was just like, and then I actually decided to get it because it was a whole like internal process for her. Yeah, so she began to develop this hatred of the technology that helped her, and then slowly came to accept it more in the end. But the acting thing was big for her though.
Did she ever do anything?
Yeah, so there's a very important chapter in the book that talks about her experience in the acting world. She applied for a college, and they actually turned her down because while she was deaf, she could still speak fine with a lisp because she couldn't exactly hear how the sounds were coming out, in her head. So there was a long chapter, I think it was called The Drag Years or something like that. Drag Acts was what it was. And it was about her getting turned down from college from theater because she wouldn't be able to speak properly. But then instead she finds a small Shakespeare acting group, and she gets to play the male characters, which was essentially what she wanted to do as a kid, was just be a guy. And then it goes on to talk about how, because she moved from Germany into Houston, and they weren't exactly as accepting of her, sexual preference there. So it was this interesting thing of how, she'd always play these guy characters and she always got to get the girl, and that was big for her. And then there was another, later in that chapter, it talked about how she joined with her old friend who owned a bar, I think it was, or like an old pool hall, and they do little performances there, and they got so big, like, there was like people crowding the windows and stuff, and it was like 200 people a night in this little club. And then it talks about how there was a lot of like sex and drugs and stuff, and it was really weird for her, and she just it was new, but she took it well. I don't know. It was kind of a wacky chapter. It was definitely one of the ones that was, I'd say, most jarring, because it talks a lot about how, well, it talked about specifically when they did this old play that I think she said her grandfather wrote or somebody close to her, and the main character was about this like film noir kind of guy, and he gets the girl, but the girl actor was actually like, I think she helped smuggle drugs and stuff, and she was always pretty under the influence, but they had like a 3-month relationship. It had ended with the guy who was her supplier and also who she transferred for. They all had like this 4-day binging of just like drugs and sex. Oh man, it was interesting. Yeah, I don't know. There was a lot to it. It was a pretty heavy book because it spanned somebody's life from birth all the way to current, I guess. Yeah. I don't know. There was just a lot she discussed. So yeah, that's a big time span. It really is. And it differs a little bit from my book, which is Soldier Girls: The Battles of Three Women at Home and at War by Helen Thorpe. So this took place basically from 2000 to 2008. Basically the entire Bush administration. It does start just before the 9/11 attacks. It focuses on the three women, Michelle, Debbie, and Desma. All three of them are very different from each other, but they end up being deployed all together. Michelle is the youngest one. She was 18, and they all joined the National Guard. They didn't actually sign up with any of the 4 branches of the military. Okay. So they go to they go to basic training for, I think it's 2 or 3 months, and then they serve 1 weekend a month and 2 weekends or 2 weeks in the summer. But Michelle was the youngest. She signed up when she was 18. She signed up specifically because of the GI Bill. She wanted the money for school. She had big dreams of going off to college and wanted that money to help. So she signed up that way. Debbie is the oldest one. She was in her late 40s when she enlisted in the National Guard. And she wanted to feel fulfilled. She joined for fulfillment, which I totally understand. Desma joined in the most interesting way. She was in her mid-20s when she enlisted in 2000, or around 2000. She joined. She was drunk when her and her friend went to. You have to go through like a test, like a fitness test when you're joining the Guard. And her and her friend thought it would be funny to go and just go through it while they were drunk. Mm-hmm. And her friend told her, they'll never pick us anyways. Well, her friend didn't get enlisted, but she did. And she was drunk when she signed all of the stuff and was kind of not ready for what she signed up for. I see. So it wasn't great for her. Mm-hmm. But they were all fine up until the September 11th attacks, and that's when the National Guard was kind of they were told initially that they weren't going to be deployed. Nothing was changing. A few months went by, and then they were all told that they would be deployed to Afghanistan, which was a shock to all of them. Mm-hmm. Michelle and Desma definitely didn't want to go. Desma has children. Has children.
so she struggled to find, what are you going to do with your children for a year? Mm-hmm. And the father wasn't around in the picture, so right. She left her children with family. Michelle was in a relationship. She was already in school. She was just completely devastated that she had to stop and go do that. And none of these women thought they would actually be deployed. Mm-hmm. Debbie had to fight to go. They weren't initially going to send her, mm-hmm. but because of her age. Mm-hmm. And when she found out that everybody was being deployed, she harped on her commanders and everything because she wanted to go, and finally they said, okay, we'll send you.
So Debbie was the youngest, is that right?
Debbie was the oldest.
The oldest?
Oldest.
Okay.
Gotcha. They weren't going to send her because she was too old, because she was almost 50 at this point.
Right.
So she fought, and because she wanted to go. She was very, very sure that that's where she wanted to be. Mm-hmm. And she was in a relationship as well. She was dating someone. They weren't married. Mm-hmm. So her and her boyfriend stayed at her house to take care of her dog and everything while they were gone. So they all got deployed to Afghanistan, which makes me a little mad, actually, reading about their time in Afghanistan. It wasn't easy for them. I'm going to say that.
I bet.
Constantly living in fear that something could happen at any time. They were the Bravo team, mm-hmm. which is like second chair or second bench, whatever you want to say. Mm-hmm. They never saw any action. I shouldn't say action because it's not like it's fun or anything.
Right.
They never saw anything. They were fighting boredom their entire year in Afghanistan. They would Debbie got into alcohol quite a bit, and they weren't allowed alcohol. They're not allowed alcohol there. But there was other military from other countries there that were allowed to drink while they were there. So they would make friends with, I believe they made friends with a couple Danish guys who would supply them with alcohol.
Okay.
So Debbie did develop a bit of a drinking habit. Michelle and Desma would get their hands on anything, especially marijuana. They would get pot brownies mailed to them from their friends back here in the States.
It's crazy.
I know.
Go through mail, honestly.
Yeah, they just mailed these so many pot brownies.
Oh,
it's insane. And then they would share them with some of the girls in their company or in their the tents that they stayed in. Mm-hmm. Michelle and Desma stayed in the same tent. Debbie had a different tent, but all three of them still hung out together.
Right.
So, a lot of their time in Afghanistan was fighting boredom. Honestly, I expected more fighting for their sex, really. I mean, just being women in the military, but mm-hmm. it wasn't really spoken about that they really had any problems with that. And there was a lot of sex as well, and a lot of cheating on partners back here mm-hmm. at home. So it was a struggle for me to digest the fact that we sent National Guard over to Afghanistan mm-hmm. For them to just fear for their lives, be bored as hell, and not actually feel like they all left there feeling like they didn't do anything, mm-hmm. and they all got like commendations and awards and things like that, and none of them felt like they deserved them because mm-hmm. they literally didn't do anything. Also, they were very upset when they found out. So there was a translator, an Afghan translator. His name was Akbar, mm-hmm. and they became very close, all three of them. And he kind of revealed the fact that the only reason people were in Afghanistan the way they were was because there's a range of mountains in Afghanistan that contains the most lithium than anywhere else on Earth. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of this revelation that the whole war was about cell phone batteries. Because if you think about it, in the early 2000s, that's right when cell phones were getting big and right before smartphones. And so they kind of alluded to the fact that the whole war was, or at least in Afghanistan, was
really
not what we were told it was about. It was more about
gathering.
It was about resources and those lithium batteries.
Wild.
So they all come back home. They do have a hard time readjusting, especially Michelle. Her group of friends, she had made these comments about how she was very similar to them when she left, but when she came back, she had grown and she had matured, but they had remained the same. And even though it was only a year, like, she expected some growth from her friends, and she found they didn't have much in common anymore, which was really sad. So she struggled with that, and Desma's children. When she came home, she kept her kids living with her family members because she didn't want to remove them from school again and uproot them in the middle of a school year. And so she lived 50 miles away from her children, even though she had come back just until the school year had
Right.
And Debbie was pretty okay when she came back. But she was happy to see her boyfriend, and she was worried actually that he wouldn't want her anymore. But everything ended up working out well with the two of them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And was anything ever brought up with them about, like, the cheating and the sex and stuff?
No. Michelle she did end up breaking up with her boyfriend here in the States and ended up in a solid relationship with the guy that she was sleeping with in Afghanistan.
Okay.
But that didn't end up working out either. So then she met another gentleman who she had trained with in base camp, which was, at this point was a while ago.
Right.
She got together with him again, and they ended up moving to Colorado. All three of these women were based in Indiana.
Oh, okay.
So Michelle and then the guy she ended up staying with moved to Colorado, and she remained in the Guard. They all remained in the Guard, but there was a second deployment after they came back, and Michelle did not go. Because of that move, she wasn't required to go.
Right.
But Desma and Debbie did go back, but this time they went to Iraq instead of Afghanistan. And honestly, it was at the end of the book, so they kind of sped through Iraq just a bit, so there wasn't a whole bunch. But the biggest and notable event that happened there was Desma. She was driving military vehicles, convoys, back and forth. They just were driving back and forth, supplies back and forth. And every convoy has, like a gunner and somebody who's navigating.
Right.
But she was the driver, so they came across a box on the side of the road, and there was known bombs everywhere, all over there. So they were checking it out, being cautious. Somebody was leaning out the truck to try to look into the box, and they asked if Desma could get a little bit closer, the truck a little bit closer, and she accidentally ran over it. And nobody died, everybody was fine, but she got a pretty bad head injury to the point where she became dyslexic.
Really?
And could not remember, it was basically a short-term memory loss type thing. So if you would tell her things, she couldn't remember that 5 minutes later.
Really?
Which turned out to be quite a struggle for her coming home and everything. But that was the most notable thing when they got deployed the second time.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah. So
but none of them died, though.
No, none of them died, and they really only focused on the death of one soldier who they didn't even really focus on in the book. He was just part of their company. And so they obviously were very sad when a fellow soldier of theirs passes away. But that was really the only death in the book as far as over in Afghanistan.
Okay.
Or Iraq.
Right, that's interesting. So, I don't know, they're pretty different books.
They are pretty different books. I did not know that yours focused on a girl, though.
Yeah.
So it does sound like they had some feminine similarities.
Yeah.
Desma actually dabbled with a woman while in Iraq. So she actually, when she came home, they continued to see each other.
Really?
So she kind of switched teams in the middle there. But it sounds like they all had struggles. They were all so different. Yeah, they really were.
I guess in a sense, she mentioned it. I didn't really remember any chapter specifically about it, but Terry talked about how she had some issues with alcohol and drug use, and it sounds like the girls in your book had...
there was a lot of alcohol and not drug use, but marijuana usage.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess it kind of shows like the diversity of everything, though. Like, somebody can, because I don't know, what time frame are you looking at here?
2000 to 2008.
Okay, because this one talked about it was mostly around 1970, 1980, I think. And
I'm assuming because you said they had moved from Germany that a lot of the earlier years happened in Germany.
Yeah, a good chunk of them did. You know, they talked about how, because her father was a Russian spy, so he was always going. Right. You know, and he had a counterpart and like a fake identity and everything, and he spoke Russian. But so the family and the girls lived on a German military, it was an American military base in Germany, and there was this whole thing about how.
So were they American or were they?
I think they were American. Okay. Yeah, originally from Texas, which they moved back to eventually. Okay. But
so there's a huge similarity. They were all military related.
Yeah, in a sense. She didn't have anything really much to do with the military other than, because in the Cold War they tell families like, here's a briefcase. If anything bad happens and the apocalypse is coming, open this. And when she was younger, she didn't know it at the time, but they had this really intense game of hide and seek. I think they called it stalk, where the parents would like stalk the kids through the house and they try and like have to hide because the soldiers are coming. And she was just like, okay, well I'll just empty the contents of this case for a second and hide in it, and she opened the case and there was nothing in it. And it was kind of like this placebo thing, I think mostly for kids. Like, I don't know if the adults ever open them, but hypothetically, if anything bad were to happen, it's like they talked about how there's no plan.
Wow.
Yeah, it was kind of like heavy. It's just like, yeah, everybody on the base, here's a special military case. If something happens and like bombs are dropped, open this. There's nothing in it. So.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Why would they do that?
It's like, I don't know, because they were taught in their school, like, yeah, go to your parents, they'll have the case. I don't know if parents were told to not open it until something happened, but, like, it was essentially to say, like, there is no plan, like, good luck. I don't know, it's kind of interesting in that sense.
Yeah, that is interesting. Mm-hmm. I'm more interested in her bullying, though, because she was the bully.
She was the bully.
Did she ever, like, come to terms with it and shed that bully, or did she continue to be that way?
As she talked about it, she was kind of like, yeah, I came to like embrace it, and I used that form of bullying to kind of like influence my acting, I guess, and it helped her come, I guess, more in tune with other people's emotions. But at the same time, she saw it as a means of like improving her ability to get what she wants. Like she had another example of when she was younger. She saw the show about Helen Keller after she knew she was going deaf. Mm-hmm. And so a thing she would do would be like, she would take off her glasses and take out her hearing aids and pretend to act like Helen Keller so she would get attention, So it was like being mean by imitating this person who was more disabled than her, right, to get, through means of acting, to get what she wanted, which was the attention. Okay. Okay. It's different.
At what age did she go deaf or start going deaf?
She started, I think, at 9. Okay. Yeah, there's also this thing she talked about, how she'd like see these, like have these visions of herself floating above herself, kind of like a dissociation thing, like looking down at her body. A little bit, yeah. It was kind of, I don't remember her tying anything more to it than just like.
Okay, so we don't know what happened right there. But
I don't know how. I hope
the camera stopped recording.
I hope that wasn't cut out too long.
Yeah, I don't know where that stopped.
I guess we'll find it in post.
Right. Where should we pick up?
I don't know. Where did we leave off?
What were you talking about just now?
Terry's like dissociation, astral projection.
Right. So she would see herself in her dreams hovering over her body, or not in her dreams, but
I mean, she would still be like functioning fine. Like one of the examples she talked about was she was in gym in a race, you know, with some other kids, and she was like up in the rafters, looking down at herself, still running. Like it was weird. Oh, but then there was another time she said like, oh, they were always fun. They were like my little secrets, and I tried to tell my sister, and she dared me to jump off the roof because I said I could fly, and I hurt. But then she also talked about how it was the 4th of July, and she was sitting out with her parents, and she had the same kind of vision, but she saw this shadowy figure with like a really malicious intent, like going for her body and trying to take over, you know. So she raced it back to her body, and like, I don't know, it was this weird. It was this weird imagery. Yeah, she said like, I never wanted to have them again after that. Like it was just terrifying.
Yeah, that's really weird.
That's kind of spooky.
Yeah. Did she ever come across any struggles from being female? Because one of the things that you talked about actually that's kind of interesting is that she would play the male parts, and you mentioned Shakespeare as well, which that's what I found interesting because in Shakespearean times the men would play the women because women were not allowed to do that.
It was actually really interesting because she was just like from you know when I was younger after my disability like kind of started to really impact me. I was done with being a girl, and I wanted to. That was my life. Now my new life goal was to just be a boy, you know. And it was this really interesting thing how she hypothetically would have been scrutinized, you know, at least in our time, I think too. Like if you were a girl trying to be a boy, people would look at you funny. But back then, I mean, like she cut her hair and she wore, you know, the pants and the shirt, and like. I don't know. It didn't ever really seem to negatively impact her. Like through what I can remember, she got accepted into the group of bully boys. She got to play the boys' parts in her theater. You know, she got the girl. I don't know.
Do you think it was because of her disability, or that like people just didn't want to?
I think it was the mindset. Like, because I mean, it happened to continue throughout her whole life. Like,
so it sounds like being a bully was what helped her. You know, kind of advance.
That was a part of it. Actually, there was a part in here. I don't think it's worth trying to find. But she was talking about how like on the playground, I just wanted to be a boy, and I think in the way that I can do that is to be like the girls, or like to be like the other boys, and you know what makes them more manly. Then they're picking on girls, you know, and I guess that kind of just.
So that's what she associated.
And so that kind of, you know, even though she changed her mind about really wanting to be picking on the girls later, like, I guess it still kind of really influenced her attention towards it. I don't know. It's really interesting. I feel like I've been talking most of the time. I want to ask you questions, but like, you gave a really good description. I mean,
well, my girls actually did struggle a little bit as far as, so when you were in the military, you have a job. And what I found interesting was, even though this was in the early 2000s, they were limited on the jobs that they were allowed to do. So Michelle ended up fixing guns.
Okay.
That's all she did while she was in Afghanistan, was fix a bunch of guns that either broke or even just polishing them. That was all she was allowed to do.
Okay.
Desma worked with radios, and she would go around and she would calibrate everybody's radios so everybody was on the same frequency and nothing was too staticky and everybody could hear each other well.
Right.
Debbie, unfortunately, she enjoyed it. So I shouldn't say unfortunately, but she ran a food cart.
Oh.
She was kind of labeled as like the mom of their company. So she ran a food cart. She was great for their morale. And I think her officers saw that, and that's why they had her do that.
Do you think any part of that was like, you know, she's not here for the fighting. She's a morale girl because she is a woman.
Well, she's the one that fought to go. She's the one that wanted to go.
That's right.
So it was. She was a little upset that that's what she ended up doing, but she was very happy to help her fellow soldiers with morale. So I remember this one scene, I guess, where Michelle was describing, and this was when she was at basic training. she was sitting at her desk or table or whatever it was in like a classroom with a gun completely disassembled in front of her, and she had to clean it, fix it, and put it all back together. It was like a practical exam almost. And she just sat there staring at it, like just completely wondering what she had got herself into just for college tuition money.
Right.
But and she didn't feel like she was capable of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
But she just kept telling herself, I can do this, and I have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
To the point where she got so good at it that she got a special award when she left Afghanistan for fixing so many so quickly. And I think she had fixed the most of the whole, everybody doing that job in that company.
Even the men?
I don't think men were doing it.
They weren't doing it, okay. Well,
yeah, I don't think the men were. And honestly, they didn't really touch on what anybody else was doing, so I don't really know what the men were doing. I know Desma was flirting with a gentleman who fixed the trucks. Was like a mechanic.
Right.
So I know some of them did that, but I don't know what the rest of them did in their company. And in the Alpha company were obviously on the field. So
I don't know. It sounds interesting then how there were really different situations. Well, because you think of now we're like more progressive towards women, but this was an older situation. You know, like in older times. That she was more accepted for doing, this manly stuff, and your girls sound like they were still...
Yeah, so this was in a more progressive time, but still struggled with being females and being told what they can and cannot do, versus back in the 70s and 80s, when it was not, definitely not okay to be different from the norm.
Yeah.
And just fighting your way and...
Yeah,
being who you are.
Like, part of it might have been the profession, because the girls you read about were in the army, and she became an actor.
Right.
If I know anything about theater, theater kids are freaks. I was a theater kid. So I don't know, but regardless, just being able to do everything that they did, it feels really, I don't know, I feel for them in
Yeah, they definitely all changed through their experiences.
Right.
I know, because Michelle wasn't completely out of the picture when Desma and Debbie went to Iraq. There was a lot of email communication between the three of them. But there was a point where, it was actually when Desma had hit the IED bomb. So the soldiers are told, if something like that happens, you don't tell people back at home.
Right.
Because you're a soldier that just experienced something in a war zone, and you don't need the extra stress of family or friends worrying about you and trying to get in touch with you when you can't always be available to talk with them because you're in a war zone. So Michelle was very, very hurt when they came back home the second time and found out what had happened. The last scene of the book actually was a little heartbreaking, because the three of them and a few other soldiers, they all got together for a weekend in a cabin that was in a state park in Indiana. And they had all gotten along so well during Afghanistan, but when everybody came back from Iraq, there was almost this disassociation with everybody. And everybody was so shaken. And Michelle was, because she hadn't gone, she was feeling very distant from that. They had lived through something completely different than what she had experienced in Afghanistan. So she felt like she couldn't relate, and they felt themselves kind of growing apart. And I think one of them had mentioned, I don't think we're going to continue these weekend retreat type things, especially because the Iraq girls, they both had a little bit of PTSD, especially Desma with driving. She had to see a therapist and drive up and down a highway all day,
really,
to get over this fear of driving that she had developed from hitting that IED on the road.
Right.
So that was just one more thing that she had to overcome herself, that Michelle couldn't relate to, and Debbie could only sympathize with, because Debbie was not there when that bomb was hit. So they were all really, really, really close, and then it was almost like a second war kind of tore them up again.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to relate the two, honestly, like, because there was nothing really like any kind of war or anything in this other than, the war on good manners.
I think what ties these two together is the struggle of being a female in a very different world. These ladies were females in a very male-dominated war zone, where she was a female who identified more with males and tried to
kind of fit in with them.
Right, fight her way in with them.
Yeah, I think the difference though was, like, the big one was that she did not have a hard time at all, and these girls seemed to struggle quite a bit with.
But they were all three of them were very strong as well.
Right. No, that's not to knock on.
The struggles that these girls went up against were because there was other people pushing back. It doesn't sound like she had much pushback.
I guess kind of a theme about this book was whenever there was somebody bad, for example, the Russians in the war, or she talked a lot about times about herself being really against her. She called anybody who was against her a them. They are against me. And she talked about how that was like herself. Sometimes it'd be other people. It'd be a whole country against her, or then also the shadowy figure of a child that she saw as a them. They're all thems, people who knocked on her for having a disability. It was kind of an interesting point of view.
Yeah.
Talking about how, like, probably the biggest them that I ever faced was myself, because I was always like wanting to destroy myself for my differences. It's interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah. Diversity in its finest.
Diversity. These are very diverse women. I will say, Rabby, because you did ask us to tell you if we liked this book. I hated this book. But it wasn't because it was a bad book. It was the subject matter. I just don't like war, and the time frame of this book was all 4 years of high school for me, and the 4 years after high school, which I think for most people is kind of a political awakening. And Bush's second term was the first election that I was able to vote in. So it was very, I didn't enjoy it. And it really made me dislike the Bush administration even more than I already did.
Yeah, I would say I actually rather enjoyed my book, because in a lot of terms, like a lot of times you hear all these stories from LGBTQ people who are always in their, like, they'll write a memoir or something in a book and they'll be like, yeah, and my life was hard and I hated it, and this is, and I'm sad and now I live with all these issues. But Galloway really, like, took almost a comedical stance, I'd say, about it. It was a really lighthearted book, and it had a lot of pretty wacky stories. I mean, obviously any book's gonna have, like, sad times, but she really kind of brought an upbeat tune, I'd say. Like, she was really pretty happy with how her life turned out, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, actually, that is this book was fairly, for being the subject matter that it is, was pretty positive overall. And clearly, obviously, like you said too, the women are going to go through some struggles and some sad and depressing times, and there was a couple heartbreaking stories in there, but for the most part, it stayed fairly upbeat. So it wasn't sad all throughout.
Gotcha. Wild.